Welcome back to another journey through history's most fascinating transformations. Before we dive into today's incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Are you settling in after a long day, or perhaps starting your morning with a cup of coffee? Drop a comment and let me know what time zone you're in. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected across the globe, sharing these moments of discovery together. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's most compelling mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more stories to uncover, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now picture this scene for a moment. It's the 1st century, and you're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome. The air is thick with the scent of spices from distant lands, the chatter of merchants haggling over prices, and the rhythmic clank of soldiers' armor as they patrol the cobblestones. But there's something else in the air too, something that makes citizens avert their eyes and quicken their pace when they reach the outskirts of the city. There, on a hill just outside the city walls, stands a forest of wooden beams reaching toward the sky like grotesque trees. These aren't monuments to glory or symbols of hope. They're instruments of the most brutal, degrading form of execution the ancient world had ever devised. The cross wasn't a symbol of salvation back then. It was a symbol of ultimate shame, reserved for the worst criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state. Yet somehow, impossibly, this very symbol that once represented society's deepest contempt would eventually become the most recognizable emblem of hope, love, and redemption in human history. How did something so universally despised transform into something so universally revered? How did the cross rise from the depths of shame to become a global beacon of hope? Tonight, I'm going to take you on an extraordinary journey spanning 2,000 years, revealing the most remarkable transformation in the history of human symbols. We'll explore the psychological forces that turned disgrace into glory, the political machinations that changed the course of empires, and the individual stories of courage that defied an entire civilization's understanding of power and meaning. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. This wasn't just about changing people's minds about a piece of wood. This transformation reveals something profound about human nature itself, about our capacity to find meaning in suffering, and about how symbols can literally reshape the world. By the end of this series, you'll understand not just how the cross became a global symbol, but why this transformation tells us something crucial about the power of belief to overcome even the most impossible odds. You'll see how a small group of people, armed with nothing but conviction, managed to flip the entire Roman Empire's value system upside down. And trust me, the methods they used to accomplish this seemingly impossible feat are more relevant today than you might imagine. But first, we need to understand just how deeply the cross was embedded in the ancient world's consciousness as a symbol of ultimate degradation. Because until you grasp the sheer impossibility of what happened next, you can't appreciate the magnitude of this transformation. The Roman Empire didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. They turned it into an art form of public humiliation. This wasn't just about killing someone, though the death was agonizing beyond description. This was about destroying a person's dignity so completely that even their memory would be tainted with shame. When a Roman citizen looked at a cross, they didn't see potential for redemption. They saw the ultimate boundary marker of civilized society. It said, in no uncertain terms, this is what happens when you step outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. It was a visual reminder that there were fates worse than death, fates that could strip away not just your life, but your very humanity. Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators, captured this sentiment perfectly when he declared that the very word cross should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. For Romans, even speaking about crucifixion was considered degrading to civilized discourse. But here's where our story takes its first unexpected turn. In the backwaters of the Roman Empire, in a province most Romans considered barely worth governing, a small group of people began to see something entirely different when they looked at a cross. These weren't philosophers or politicians or military leaders. They were fishermen, tax collectors, former prostitutes, and social outcasts. By every measure Roman society used to determine worth and credibility, these people were nobodies. Yet they began to spread an idea so radical, so completely contrary to everything their world believed, that it would ultimately bring the mightiest empire in history to its knees. They claimed that the cross, that ultimate symbol of shame and defeat, was actually the key to understanding the deepest truths about power, love, and the meaning of human existence. They said that in the most shameful death their world could devise, something beautiful and redemptive had taken place. Now you have to understand how this sounded to ancient ears. Imagine trying to convince people today that electric chairs or gas chambers were actually symbols of hope and love. That's the level of cognitive dissonance these early believers were asking people to embrace. It wasn't just counterintuitive. It was offensive, shocking, and to most people, obviously insane. The Apostle Paul, one of the most influential figures in this transformation, acknowledged just how crazy their message sounded. He wrote that they were preaching Christ crucified, which was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Even he admitted that what they were claiming seemed impossible to believe. Yet something extraordinary began to happen. Despite having every social, political, and cultural force working against them, despite facing persecution, mockery, and death, these early believers began to attract followers. Not just a few, but thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. What was their secret? How did they manage to convince people to see beauty where their entire civilization saw only horror? How did they transform the ultimate symbol of powerlessness into the ultimate symbol of power? The answer lies in understanding something profound about human psychology and the nature of meaning itself. These early believers weren't just changing people's minds about the cross. They were fundamentally rewiring how people understood the relationship between suffering and significance, between weakness and strength, between death and life. They told stories, but not the kind of stories their world was used to hearing. Roman culture celebrated heroes who conquered through strength, who achieved glory through victory, who proved their worth through dominance. But these believers told stories of a different kind of hero entirely. One who conquered through surrender, who achieved glory through sacrifice, who proved his worth through service. At the center of their story was a figure who willingly walked toward the cross, not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone choosing to redefine what victory looked like. This wasn't a story about avoiding suffering, but about transforming it. Not about escaping death, but about using death as a doorway to something greater. But perhaps most revolutionary of all, they claimed this transformation was available to everyone. You didn't need to be born into nobility, or achieve great military victories, or accumulate vast wealth. You could be a slave, a criminal, or an outcast, and still participate in this cosmic reversal of values. This message began to spread through the Roman Empire like wildfire, but not in the way you might expect. It didn't start in the halls of power or the academies of learning. It started in the places Roman society preferred to ignore, in the slums and markets, among slaves and immigrants, in the homes of the poor and forgotten. These people had something the wealthy and powerful lacked. They understood suffering. They knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be despised, to be treated as less than human. When they heard a message that said their suffering had meaning, that their weakness could become strength, that their shame could become honor, it resonated in a way that no philosophical argument ever could. But this grassroots movement faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Rome wasn't just politically opposed to this message, it was psychologically unable to process it. The entire structure of Roman society, from its religious beliefs to its legal system to its military organization, was built on the assumption that might makes right, that strength conquers weakness, that honor comes through domination. For Rome to accept the cross as a symbol of hope would require nothing less than a complete inversion of everything Roman civilization stood for. It would mean admitting that their most cherished values were wrong, that their greatest achievements were meaningless, that their entire worldview was fundamentally flawed. Yet somehow, impossibly, that's exactly what began to happen. The transformation didn't occur overnight, and it wasn't without tremendous cost. Thousands of believers paid with their lives for refusing to abandon their allegiance to this new understanding of the cross. They were thrown to wild animals in the Colosseum, burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens, and subjected to tortures so creative and brutal that even hardened Roman soldiers sometimes turned away in disgust. But here's what made this movement truly unstoppable. Every act of persecution only seemed to strengthen it. Every public execution became a demonstration of the very values these believers claimed the cross represented. Instead of breaking under torture, they forgave their torturers. Instead of cursing their fate, they sang hymns of joy. Instead of abandoning their beliefs to save their lives, they chose to die rather than deny what they had come to understand about the meaning of the cross. Roman authorities found themselves facing a completely unprecedented situation. Their usual methods of social control, which had worked flawlessly for centuries, were not only ineffective against these believers but actually seemed to be helping their cause spread faster. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, though the believers themselves might not have thought of it in those terms. They were simply living out what they believed to be the logical implications of their understanding of the cross. But in doing so, they were systematically undermining the philosophical foundations of Roman power. Think about it from a Roman perspective. Your entire system of government, law, and social order is based on the idea that people will ultimately choose survival over principle, comfort over conviction, safety over sacrifice. Your empire exists because conquered peoples eventually accept that resistance is futile, that it's better to submit than to suffer. But suddenly, you're dealing with people who seem to have transcended these basic human motivations. They're not afraid of pain. They're not intimidated by threats. And they're not impressed by displays of power. In fact, your attempts to break them only seem to make them stronger and more convinced than ever that they possess something you lack. This created a crisis that went to the very heart of Roman identity. If the cross, their ultimate symbol of defeat and degradation, could be transformed into a symbol of victory and honor, what did that say about all their other symbols of power and glory? If a crucified criminal could inspire more loyalty than Caesar, what did that say about the nature of true authority? The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. It wasn't just challenging Roman political power, it was challenging the entire Roman understanding of how the universe worked. It suggested that everything they thought they knew about strength and weakness, honor and shame, victory and defeat, was not just wrong, but backwards. And this brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of this transformation that we'll explore in depth in our next episode. The rise of the cross from shame to hope wasn't just about changing religious beliefs. It was about a fundamental shift in how human beings understood power itself. The believers weren't just offering people a new God to worship. They were offering a completely new way of understanding what it means to be powerful, what it means to be valuable, what it means to matter in the grand scheme of existence. They were proposing that the cross revealed truths about the nature of reality that had been hidden from human understanding until that moment. But how exactly did they manage to convince an entire empire to embrace this radical reversal of values? What specific strategies did they use to transform the meaning of their most hated symbol? And perhaps most importantly, What can we learn from their methods about the power of belief to reshape reality itself? These are the questions we'll tackle as we continue this incredible journey through one of history's most remarkable transformations. The transformation we're witnessing wasn't happening in isolation. While these believers were redefining the cross in the shadows of Roman society, the empire itself was beginning to show cracks that would prove crucial to this symbol's eventual triumph. By the 2nd century, Rome was facing challenges that its traditional sources of strength couldn't address. The empire had grown so vast that communication took months. Rebellions sprouted faster than they could be suppressed, and the cost of maintaining order was bleeding the treasury dry. More troubling still, the very success that had built Rome was creating a spiritual vacuum at its heart. Picture the life of a typical Roman citizen during this period. Marcus Aurelius Flavius lived in a comfortable villa outside Rome, owned several slaves, and enjoyed all the privileges his citizenship could provide. Yet, his private letters reveal a man haunted by questions his culture couldn't answer. He had witnessed the gladiatorial games, the public executions, the displays of imperial power that were supposed to demonstrate Rome's greatness. But instead of feeling inspired, he felt hollow. Marcus wrote to a friend, "We have conquered the world, yet we cannot conquer the emptiness within our own souls. Our gods are stories told by poets, our victories are temporary, and our glory dies with our bodies. What is the point of all this power if it cannot give meaning to our existence?" Marcus wasn't alone in these feelings. Across the empire, people were searching for something that could fill the void that material success and political dominance had failed to address. Traditional Roman religion offered rituals and festivals, but little in the way of personal comfort or ultimate purpose. Philosophy provided intellectual satisfaction for the educated elite, but most people needed something more accessible, more emotionally resonant. Into this spiritual hunger stepped the believers with their transformed understanding of the cross. But they weren't simply offering another religion to add to Rome's already crowded pantheon of gods. They were offering something far more radical, a complete reinterpretation of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The genius of their approach lay in how they presented this message. Rather than attacking Roman values directly, they told stories that revealed the limitations of those values. They didn't argue that power was evil. They demonstrated that there was a power greater than political or military might. They didn't condemn wealth. They showed that there were treasures more valuable than gold or land. Consider how they handled one of Rome's most fundamental concepts: honor. Roman honor was based on public recognition, military achievement, and social status. It was something you earned through conquest and maintained through displays of strength. But the believers introduced a radically different understanding of honor, one that could be achieved by anyone regardless of their social position. A slave named Perpetua exemplified this new kind of honor. When arrested for her beliefs, she was given multiple opportunities to save herself simply by making a small gesture of loyalty to the Roman gods. Her family pleaded with her, her friends abandoned her, and the authorities offered her wealth and freedom if she would just compromise her convictions. But Perpetua understood something about honor that her society couldn't grasp. She realized that there were some things more valuable than life itself, some principles more important than personal safety. When she walked into the arena to face the wild beasts, she wasn't just dying for her beliefs. She was demonstrating a kind of courage that made Roman military valor look pale by comparison. The crowd that came to watch her execution, expecting entertainment, found themselves witnessing something they had no framework to understand. This young woman faced death not with the grim resignation of a defeated enemy, but with a joy and peace that seemed to transform the very nature of what they were watching. Reports of Perpetua's death spread throughout the empire, and with each retelling, the story grew more powerful. People began to ask themselves difficult questions. If this woman could find such strength and purpose in what appeared to be the ultimate defeat, what did that say about their own definitions of victory and success? This pattern repeated itself hundreds, then thousands of times across the Roman world. Each public execution of a believer became an unintentional advertisement for the power of their transformed understanding of the cross. The Romans found themselves in the impossible position of trying to destroy a movement by giving it exactly the kind of public platform it needed to spread. But the believers' influence wasn't limited to these dramatic moments of martyrdom. They were also quietly revolutionizing daily life in ways that Roman society found increasingly attractive. In a world where social relationships were based primarily on power dynamics and mutual exploitation, the believers created communities built on radically different principles. In their gatherings, social distinctions that defined Roman life began to break down. Slaves and masters sat together as equals. Women spoke and participated in ways that violated every convention of proper behavior. The poor were treated with the same respect as the wealthy. Former criminals were welcomed alongside respected citizens. These communities weren't perfect, and they faced their own internal struggles and conflicts. But they offered something that Roman society couldn't provide, a sense of belonging that wasn't based on what you could achieve or accumulate, but simply on your humanity. Julia Marcella was a wealthy Roman matron who first encountered these believers when her household slave became ill. In Roman society, a sick slave was typically seen as a liability to be disposed of quickly and efficiently. But when Julia's Christian neighbors learned of the situation, they responded in a way that completely violated her understanding of how the world worked. Instead of ignoring the suffering of someone so far beneath their social status, these believers nursed the slave back to health, treating her with the same care they would have given to a member of their own family. When Julia asked why they would waste time and resources on someone who could never repay them, their answer challenged everything she thought she knew about human nature. They told her that their actions weren't based on expectations of reward or social advancement. They were motivated by their understanding of what the cross revealed about the value of every human life. In their view, the same divine love that had transformed that instrument of shame into a symbol of hope also transformed how they saw every person they encountered. This practical demonstration of their beliefs proved more persuasive than any theological argument could have been. Julia found herself drawn not just to their ideas about the cross, but to the way those ideas changed how they lived. She began attending their gatherings, not because she was intellectually convinced of their doctrines, but because she was emotionally attracted to the quality of life they had created. As more people like Julia joined these communities, the movement began to attract attention from Roman intellectuals who had previously dismissed it as a superstition for the uneducated masses. Philosophers and scholars started taking seriously this group's claim that the cross represented a new understanding of fundamental human questions. Marcus Minucius Felix was a Roman lawyer and philosopher who initially approached the believers as a curious observer, intending to write a critique of their beliefs. But as he studied their literature and attended their gatherings, he found himself confronting ideas that challenged his most basic assumptions about reality. The believers weren't offering simple answers to complex questions. Instead, they were providing a completely different framework for understanding what the important questions actually were. Instead of asking how to achieve power, they asked how to serve others. Instead of wondering how to accumulate wealth, they explored how to find contentment. Instead of seeking to dominate their enemies, they investigated how to love them. Most revolutionary of all, they claimed that these weren't just ethical preferences or philosophical opinions. They believed that the cross had revealed these principles as fundamental laws of the universe, as basic to reality as gravity or mathematics. They weren't suggesting that people ought to live this way because it was nice or socially beneficial. They were claiming that this was how reality actually worked at its deepest level. This assertion put the believers on a collision course with Roman philosophy and religion in ways that went far beyond simple disagreement. They were essentially claiming that everything Roman civilization was built on represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of existence itself. The Roman worldview assumed that the universe was ultimately governed by power and chance. The strong survived, the weak perished, and meaning was whatever humans decided to create for themselves. Success was measured by your ability to impose your will on others and on circumstances. But the believers claimed that the cross revealed a universe governed by very different principles. They said it showed that apparent weakness could be the highest form of strength, that suffering could be more meaningful than success, that death could be the gateway to life. Most shocking of all, they claimed that these weren't just poetic metaphors, but literal truths about how reality functioned. This cosmic claim gave their movement a confidence and persistence that Roman authorities found deeply unsettling. These weren't people simply advocating for social reform or political change. They believed they had discovered the operating manual for the universe itself, and that discovery made them willing to endure any hardship rather than abandon what they saw as ultimate truth. The psychological impact of this conviction cannot be overstated. When you believe you've glimpsed the fundamental structure of reality, persecution becomes not just bearable, but almost welcome, because it provides opportunities to demonstrate the truth of what you've discovered. Every attempt to break your spirit becomes a chance to prove that your spirit draws its strength from sources beyond human power. This is why Roman attempts at suppression kept backfiring so spectacularly. The authorities were trying to combat people who genuinely believed that death was not the worst thing that could happen to them, that suffering could be transformative rather than simply destructive, and that apparent defeat could actually be the highest form of victory. As word of these impossible people spread throughout the empire, something began to shift in the Roman consciousness. The cross, which had once been such a reliable symbol of imperial power and social control, was becoming something else entirely. Instead of representing the consequences of challenging Rome, it was beginning to represent the possibility of transcending Rome altogether. This transformation was happening not through military conquest or political maneuvering, but through something far more subtle and ultimately more powerful: the gradual recognition that there might be forms of strength that Roman power couldn't touch, sources of meaning that Roman culture couldn't provide, and truths about human existence that Roman wisdom had never discovered. But perhaps the most significant development was still to come. As the 3rd century dawned, the Roman Empire would face its greatest crisis yet. And in that crucible of chaos and uncertainty, the transformed cross would emerge not just as a symbol of hope for the oppressed, but as a potential foundation for rebuilding civilization itself. The believers had succeeded in changing how people saw the cross, but they were about to discover whether their transformed symbol could change the course of history. The year 250 CE marked a turning point that would test everything the believers had built around their transformed understanding of the cross. Emperor Decius had ascended to power with a singular obsession: restore the glory of Rome by eliminating what he saw as the cancer eating away at the empire's spiritual foundation. His target wasn't military enemies or political rivals, but the growing communities that had dared to reimagine the cross as something beautiful. Decius understood something that previous emperors had missed. These believers weren't just another religious sect that could be absorbed into Rome's tolerant pantheon of gods. They represented an existential threat to the very idea of Rome itself. Their transformed cross challenged not just Roman religion, but Roman concepts of power, authority, and the natural order of society. The Decian persecution, as it came to be known, was different from the sporadic, localized crackdowns that had come before. This was systematic, empire-wide, and designed to force every person to make a clear choice: abandon your allegiance to the cross or face the consequences. There would be no middle ground, no room for private belief that didn't interfere with public order. Citizens throughout the empire were required to obtain certificates proving they had sacrificed to the Roman gods. The process was deliberately humiliating for believers. They had to publicly burn incense before statues of deities they considered false, eat meat that had been offered to idols, and declare their loyalty to religious systems they viewed as spiritually bankrupt. For many believers, this created the ultimate test of their conviction. Was their transformed understanding of the cross worth losing everything they had worked to build? Was their new definition of honor more important than protecting their families from poverty and persecution? The results were mixed in ways that revealed both the power and the limitations of what they had accomplished. Some believers, particularly those from wealthy backgrounds who had more to lose, chose to obtain the certificates while privately maintaining their beliefs. Others fled to remote areas where imperial authority was weaker. But thousands chose a third option that stunned Roman observers. They voluntarily presented themselves to authorities, refusing to compromise even when offered easy ways to avoid persecution. Polycarp of Smyrna exemplified this response when Roman officials arrested him at the age of 86. The proconsul, perhaps moved by the old man's dignity, offered him multiple opportunities to save himself. "Swear by the fortune of Caesar," he pleaded. "Revile Christ, and I will set you free." Polycarp's response became legendary throughout the Christian world. 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king and my saviour? When threatened with fire, he replied calmly, "You threaten me with fire that burns for an hour and is soon quenched, but you know nothing of the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment." But Polycarp's story reveals something even more significant than individual courage. When the flames were lit around him, witnesses reported that instead of consuming him immediately, the fire seemed to form a protective dome around his body. Whether this was literal truth, metaphorical description, or legendary embellishment, matters less than what the story reveals about how these communities understood their relationship to suffering. They weren't just enduring persecution, they were interpreting it through the lens of their transformed cross. Each act of resistance became evidence that their symbol represented access to power that transcended physical reality. Every moment of peace in the midst of torture demonstrated that their understanding of the cross had unlocked something Rome couldn't touch. These stories spread throughout the empire with remarkable speed, carried by networks of believers who had learned to communicate across vast distances despite imperial surveillance. But something interesting was happening to these stories as they traveled. They weren't just inspiring other believers to similar acts of resistance. They were beginning to attract the attention of Romans who had never shown any interest in this movement. Senator Gaius Flavius Antonius represented exactly the kind of Roman elite who should have been most opposed to these developments. He owned vast estates, commanded legions, and had built his entire career on the traditional Roman values of honor through dominance and glory through conquest. Yet his private correspondence from this period reveals a man increasingly troubled by what he was witnessing. "I have seen brave men die on battlefields," he wrote to a colleague, "but I have never seen anything like what these people display when facing death. Our soldiers fight courageously because they fear shame more than death, or because they hope for reward and recognition. But these believers seem to have transcended both hope and fear. They face execution as if they were attending a celebration." Antonius was describing something that Roman culture had no framework to understand. These believers had somehow found a source of strength that didn't depend on external circumstances or social recognition. Their transformed cross had given them access to what appeared to be an unshakable inner peace that rendered Rome's ultimate threats powerless. But perhaps more disturbing to observers like Antonius was how these believers treated their persecutors. Instead of cursing the judges who condemned them or the executioners who carried out their sentences, many believers expressed genuine forgiveness and even love for those who were destroying their lives. This response created psychological warfare of unprecedented sophistication. Roman power had always depended on the assumption that people would ultimately choose self-preservation over principle. The empire existed because conquered peoples eventually recognized the futility of resistance and accepted Roman authority as the price of survival. But these believers were demonstrating that there were forms of conviction that Roman power couldn't break. More troubling still, they were suggesting that their persecutors, not they themselves, were the ones living in spiritual poverty and existential fear. Marcus Junius Rusticus served as a judge during the Decian persecution and presided over dozens of trials involving believers. His official records show a man growing increasingly frustrated with defendants who refuse to play by the normal rules of power and submission. "When I threaten other criminals with torture," he wrote in a report to his superiors, "they become cooperative because they understand that I hold their fate in my hands. But these Christians seem to believe that I am the one who should fear the consequences of my actions. They speak to me not as subjects to their judge, but as if they possess knowledge that I lack and authority that I don't recognize." Rusticus was encountering something that threatened the very foundations of Roman legal and social order. These believers weren't just claiming that their understanding of the cross gave them access to divine power. They were acting as if that power superseded Roman authority, as if their transformed symbol represented a higher court than any earthly tribunal. This created a crisis that extended far beyond religious disagreement. If these people were right about the nature of ultimate reality, if their cross truly represented access to power that transcended political authority, then what did that say about the legitimacy of Roman rule itself? The question became even more pressing as the persecution continued, and Roman observers noticed something unprecedented. The movement was actually growing stronger under pressure. Instead of breaking under imperial assault, these communities were developing even deeper levels of unity and commitment. The reasons for this seeming paradox became clear when Roman spies infiltrated believer gatherings and reported back on what they found. These communities weren't simply enduring persecution as an unfortunate consequence of their beliefs. They were interpreting suffering through the lens of their transformed cross in ways that made hardship itself meaningful. They taught that their crucified leader had not merely survived his execution, but had transformed it into the ultimate demonstration of divine power. Death itself had been defeated not through avoiding suffering, but through embracing it completely and finding within it the seeds of new life. This theological framework gave believers a completely different relationship to persecution than any other group in Roman experience. They weren't just hoping to survive until conditions improved. They were actively seeking ways to demonstrate that their understanding of the cross had given them access to forms of strength that persecution couldn't diminish. But the most significant development was happening not among the believers themselves, but among the Romans who were observing this unprecedented response to imperial pressure. Growing numbers of citizens began asking themselves uncomfortable questions about what they were witnessing. If these people could find such peace and purpose in the face of ultimate threat, what did that say about the emptiness that characterized so much of Roman life? If their transformed cross could provide meaning that transcended circumstances, why did Roman achievements feel so hollow? If their understanding of power could survive any assault, what did that reveal about the fragility of political authority? These questions were spreading through Roman society like a slow-burning fire, creating the conditions for a transformation that would dwarf even the remarkable change in how people understood the cross itself. The believers had succeeded in proving that their symbol represented access to something Rome couldn't destroy. Now they were about to discover whether that something could actually replace Rome as the organizing principle of civilization itself. The stage was being set for the most dramatic reversal in human history. The moment when the empire that had created the cross as an instrument of shame would officially embrace it as the foundation of imperial authority. But that transformation would require events so unlikely, so contrary to every expectation, that even the believers themselves would struggle to comprehend what was happening. As the 3rd century drew to a close, both the Roman Empire and the communities gathered around the transformed cross were about to face their greatest test yet. The outcome would determine not just the fate of a religious movement, but the entire future direction of Western civilization. The cross had risen from shame to hope in the hearts and minds of millions. Soon it would face the ultimate challenge. Could it rise from the margins of society to become the very symbol of imperial power itself? The answer to that question would reshape the world in ways that no one, believer or Roman, could have imagined possible. The decade that followed the Decian persecution would witness something that defied every expectation, every precedent, every logical prediction about how empires rise and fall. As the 3rd century gave way to the 4th, the Roman world found itself spiraling into what historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of near-constant civil war, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions that brought the mightiest empire in history to the very brink of extinction. Picture the chaos that engulfed the Roman world during these dark decades. In a single 50-year span, the empire saw over 20 different men claim the title of emperor, most of whom died violent deaths within months or years of taking power. Entire provinces declared independence and established their own kingdoms. The currency became so debased that merchants refused to accept Roman coins, preferring to barter goods directly rather than trust imperial promises of value. The great cities that had been showcases of Roman civilization began to empty as people fled to the countryside seeking safety. Trade networks that had connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, collapsed under the weight of constant warfare. The sophisticated administrative system that had governed hundreds of millions of people simply stopped functioning in vast areas of the empire. Yet in the midst of this unprecedented collapse, something remarkable was happening in those communities that had gathered around the transformed cross. While Roman institutions crumbled, these believers were building something entirely new, something that seemed to grow stronger even as the world around them fell apart. Cyprian of Carthage, writing during the height of the crisis, captured what was happening with stunning clarity. The world itself testifies to its own decline by the evidence of its failing strength, he wrote. The farmer is failing in the fields, the sailor on the seas, the soldier in the camp, honesty in the market, justice in the court, friendship in society, skill in art, discipline in morals, all are failing. But then he added something that revealed the extraordinary confidence these communities had developed. Yet we who follow the cross do not mourn as those who have no hope. For we know that in apparent endings, new beginnings are always hidden. Oh, this wasn't mere optimism in the face of adversity. These believers had developed something far more powerful, a comprehensive alternative to Roman civilization itself. While the empire's institutions were failing, they were creating new forms of social organization based on their understanding of what the cross revealed about human relationships and divine purpose. Consider what was happening in the great city of Alexandria during these crisis years. As Roman authority weakened and civil order collapsed, the Christian communities didn't simply retreat into private devotion. Instead, they began taking responsibility for functions that the imperial government could no longer perform. When plague struck the city in 259 CE, Roman officials fled to their country estates, leaving the urban population to fend for themselves. But the Christian communities organized systematic relief efforts, caring not just for their own members, but for anyone who needed help, regardless of religious affiliation. They established hospitals, organized food distribution, and created burial societies to ensure that even the poorest citizens received dignified treatment in death. Dionysius of Alexandria, who led these relief efforts, wrote detailed accounts of what they accomplished. Many of our brethren, out of abundant love and brotherly affection, did not spare themselves, but kept by each other, he recorded. They visited the sick without thought of their own peril and ministered to them continually, serving them in Christ. and they died with them most joyfully, taking the affliction of others and drawing the sickness from their neighbors to themselves. But what made these efforts truly revolutionary wasn't just their compassion, remarkable though that was. It was the organizational sophistication these communities had developed and their ability to mobilize resources on a scale that rivaled imperial institutions. They had created parallel structures of authority, communication networks that spanned the empire, and financial systems that could support massive charitable undertakings. The Roman senator Publius Decius Mundus witnessed these efforts firsthand when the plague reached Rome itself. His private letters reveal a man struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "These Christians have accomplished something that our most skilled administrators could not achieve," he wrote. "They have created order out of chaos, hope out of despair, community out of the fragments of our collapsing society. I begin to wonder if they possess knowledge about governance that our political theorists have never discovered." Mundus was observing something that would prove crucial to the eventual triumph of the cross as a global symbol. These believers hadn't just transformed how people understood their ancient symbol of shame. They had used that transformed understanding to build institutions that could provide what Roman civilization, for all its military might and architectural grandeur, had never been able to deliver: a sense of meaning and purpose that could survive any external catastrophe. This practical demonstration of their beliefs created a kind of social magnetism that drew people to their communities not primarily because they were convinced by theological arguments, but because they needed what these believers had managed to create. As Roman institutions failed, people throughout the empire began looking for alternatives that could provide security, purpose, and hope for the future. Julia Domna Severina exemplified this phenomenon. She was the daughter of a Roman military commander who had spent her entire life believing that Roman power represented the highest achievement of human civilization. But when civil war reached her province and imperial legions began fighting each other instead of protecting citizens, Julia found herself questioning everything she had been taught about the source of true security. "I watched Roman soldiers burn Roman cities," she later wrote, "and I realized that the power I had revered my entire life was nothing more than organized violence that could turn against its own people at any moment. When I saw how the Christians cared for refugees from both sides of our civil wars, treating former enemies as brothers and sisters, I began to understand that their cross represented a kind of power that was actually more reliable than our legions." Julia's conversion wasn't primarily intellectual or emotional, though both elements played a role. It was fundamentally practical. She had observed two different approaches to organizing human society during a time of crisis, and one had proven dramatically superior to the other. The cross hadn't just been transformed from a symbol of shame to a symbol of hope. It had become a symbol of effective governance, based on principles that actually worked when tested by extreme circumstances. This practical appeal of the transformed cross was becoming evident throughout the collapsing empire. In Gaul, Christian communities were successfully negotiating with barbarian tribes that Roman military forces couldn't defeat. In Asia Minor, they were maintaining trade relationships that imperial diplomacy couldn't preserve. In North Africa, they were achieving levels of social cohesion that Roman administration couldn't create. But perhaps most significantly, they were attracting the attention of ambitious Romans who were beginning to calculate that alignment with these communities might offer better prospects for the future than loyalty to traditional imperial institutions. The cross wasn't just inspiring religious devotion, it was beginning to represent political opportunity for those shrewd enough to recognize which way historical forces were moving. Flavius Valerius Constantius was exactly this kind of calculating politician. As a Roman military commander during the late 3rd century, he had witnessed firsthand the empire's inability to solve its fundamental problems through traditional methods. While his colleagues continued to pursue power through the conventional means of military alliance and political manipulation, Constantius began to consider whether the future might belong to those who could harness the organizational energy that these Christian communities had developed. His son, who would later be known to history as Constantine the Great, grew up observing his father's careful study of how Christian communities functioned. The young Constantine watched as his father quietly protected Christian civilians during periods of persecution, not out of religious conviction, but because he recognized their value as citizens who could maintain order and productivity even under the most challenging circumstances. My father taught me to judge institutions by their results rather than their rhetoric, Constantine would later write. Roman politicians promised order and delivered chaos. Roman generals promised victory and delivered defeat. But these Christians promised love and actually created communities where people cared for each other more than for their own advancement. A wise ruler learns to recognize which forces in society are ascending and which are declining. This pragmatic assessment of the cross's growing influence was being made by ambitious Romans throughout the empire. They could see that traditional sources of Roman strength were exhausting themselves, while these Christian communities seemed to grow more cohesive and effective with each passing crisis. The transformed symbol wasn't just changing how people thought about suffering and redemption, it was creating new centers of power that might soon challenge or even replace traditional imperial authority. By the year 300 CE, this possibility was no longer theoretical. In some regions of the empire, Christian bishops wielded more practical authority than Roman governors. Their communities controlled more resources than imperial treasuries. Their communication networks were more reliable than official postal systems. Their ability to mobilize people for collective action surpassed that of military recruiters. The cross had completed its transformation from symbol of ultimate defeat to symbol of organizational triumph. But the most dramatic chapter in this remarkable story was yet to come. As the 4th century dawned, the Roman Empire would face one final crisis that would determine whether traditional Roman power could adapt to these new realities, or whether the transformed cross would sweep away the old order entirely and establish something unprecedented in human history. A civilization built around a symbol that had once represented nothing but shame and failure. The man who would make that determination was already positioning himself for what would become the most consequential political decision in Western history. Constantine's choice to embrace the cross wouldn't just change the Roman Empire, it would establish the template for how spiritual authority and political power could combine to create entirely new forms of civilization. But that decision was still years away, and when it came, it would surprise everyone, including Constantine himself. The path from the cross as an instrument of imperial punishment to the cross as the symbol of imperial authority would require one more impossible transformation, one that would prove that human history itself could be rewritten by those bold enough to embrace symbols that others considered worthless. The stage was set for the final act of this extraordinary drama. The question that remained was whether the empire that had created the cross as a tool of oppression could transform itself quickly enough to survive in a world where that same cross had become the foundation of hope, community, and effective governance. The answer would reshape not just the Roman world, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. And it would all turn on whether one ambitious emperor could understand what millions of ordinary believers had already discovered: that the cross represented access to forms of power that traditional politics couldn't touch, sources of authority that military might couldn't challenge, and visions of human possibility that no earthly empire could contain. The greatest reversal in history was about to unfold, and at its center stood a symbol that had traveled the impossible journey from ultimate shame to ultimate hope, proving that even the most despised emblems could be transformed by those who refused to accept the world's judgment about what was possible and what was not. The year 312 CE would witness something so extraordinary, so completely contrary to every precedent in Roman history, that even those who lived through it struggled to believe what they were seeing. Constantine, now sole ruler of the Western Roman Empire after a series of brilliant military campaigns, was marching toward the most important battle of his life. His opponent was Maxentius, who controlled Rome itself and commanded forces that significantly outnumbered Constantine's army. As Constantine's legions approached the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, the emperor found himself facing not just a military crisis, but an existential one. Everything he had learned about Roman power suggested that this battle would determine whether he lived or died, whether his ambitions would be fulfilled or destroyed. Yet something was stirring in his mind that had nothing to do with traditional military strategy or political calculation. The communities that had transformed the cross from shame to hope had been quietly influencing Constantine for years through his advisors, his wife, and even some of his military commanders. He had observed their resilience during persecution, their organizational abilities during crises, and their growing influence throughout the empire. But he had never seriously considered whether their transformed symbol might actually possess the kind of power they claimed it did. That was about to change in ways that would astonish the ancient world and reshape the course of human history. According to multiple contemporary accounts, something unprecedented occurred as Constantine contemplated the approaching battle. Whether it was a vision, a dream, or simply a moment of extraordinary political insight, Constantine became convinced that the cross, that ancient symbol of Roman shame, held the key to victory over his enemies and transformation of his empire. The emperor ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields and standards, replacing the traditional Roman eagles and imperial insignia that had led Roman armies to victory for centuries. His generals were horrified. Many of his soldiers were confused. Some of his advisors questioned whether their commander had suffered some kind of mental breakdown under the pressure of the approaching battle. Flavius Julius Constans, one of Constantine's most trusted officers, later recorded his reaction to these orders. "I had followed Constantine through dozens of campaigns and had never seen him make a decision that seemed so calculated to demoralize his own forces," he wrote. "Our soldiers were being asked to march into battle under the banner of executed criminals, to trust their lives to a symbol that every Roman had been taught to associate with defeat and disgrace." Yet something remarkable happened as Constantine's army advanced toward the Milvian Bridge. Instead of the confusion and demoralization that Constans had expected, the soldiers began to display an unusual confidence and unity. The Christian members of the army, who had previously kept their beliefs private to avoid persecution, suddenly found themselves at the center of their legion's identity rather than on its margins. But more significantly, non-Christian soldiers began to sense that they were participating in something historically momentous. They might not have understood the theological implications of what Constantine was doing, but they could recognize that their emperor was making a statement about the future direction of Roman civilization itself. Marcus Aurelius V, the Roman army for over 20 years without ever giving, Illyrius was a veteran centurion who had served in serious thought to the religious movements that had been spreading throughout the empire. His reaction to Constantine's decision reveals how this moment was being interpreted by ordinary Roman soldiers. "I didn't know much about this Christian God," he later wrote, "but I knew that the people who followed him had shown a kind of courage that our traditional gods had never seemed to inspire. If the emperor believed that their symbol could give us strength in battle, I was willing to find out if he was right." The Battle of the Milvian Bridge lasted only a few hours, but its consequences would reverberate for centuries. Constantine's forces achieved a complete victory, with Maxentius himself drowning in the Tiber River as his army collapsed in panic. But what made this battle truly extraordinary wasn't just the military outcome, but what it represented about the relationship between symbols and power. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor had publicly embraced the cross not as a tool of punishment, but as a source of divine favor. The symbol that had once represented Rome's ultimate authority to destroy its enemies had become the banner under which Rome claimed victory over its internal divisions. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. Roman soldiers who had grown up seeing crucifixion as the most degrading death imaginable had just won a decisive battle while carrying the cross as their standard. Citizens throughout the empire who had witnessed decades of Christian persecution now saw the Christian symbol flying from the palace of the emperor himself. But Constantine wasn't finished with his revolutionary transformation of imperial symbolism. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and specifically protected the rights of Christians to practice their faith openly. This wasn't just a policy change, it was a fundamental redefinition of what the Roman Empire stood for. The edict's language reveals how completely Constantine had embraced the transformed understanding of the cross that Christian communities had been developing for centuries. Instead of presenting religious tolerance as a pragmatic political compromise, he described it as recognition of divine truth that had been revealed through the symbol he had carried into battle. We have granted to Christians and to all men freedom to follow whatever religion each one wished, the edict declared, so that whatever divinity dwells in the heavenly seat may be favorable and propitious to us and to all who are under our authority. This represented a complete reversal of traditional Roman religious policy, which had always assumed that the gods favored those who demonstrated proper respect through traditional rituals and sacrifices. Constantine was suggesting that the divine realm actually preferred the kind of voluntary devotion that Christian communities had been practicing, rather than the coerced conformity that Roman religion had typically demanded. But the most significant aspect of Constantine's transformation wasn't what he did for Christians, but how he began to reshape the entire concept of imperial authority around principles that the cross had come to represent. He started making decisions that would have been incomprehensible to previous Roman emperors, choices that reflected a fundamentally different understanding of what it meant to wield ultimate power. Consider his approach to the great social issues that had plagued the Roman Empire for centuries. Instead of simply using military force to suppress unrest or economic problems to maintain order through fear, Constantine began implementing policies that reflected the Christian emphasis on caring for the vulnerable and creating just social relationships. He issued laws protecting slaves from the worst abuses, established institutions to care for orphans and widows, and began redirecting imperial resources toward projects that served ordinary citizens, rather than just glorifying imperial power. These weren't just charitable gestures. They represented a systematic attempt to govern according to principles that the transformed cross had revealed about the nature of legitimate authority. The Roman Senate struggled to comprehend what was happening. Senator Gaius Flavius Maximus, writing to a colleague in 315 CE, captured the bewilderment that many traditional Romans felt as they watched their emperor embrace values that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about effective governance. Constantine speaks of power as service, of strength through humility, of victory through sacrifice, Maximus wrote. These concepts make no sense according to everything our ancestors taught us about how to maintain an empire. Yet I cannot deny that our provinces are more peaceful, our treasury is more stable, and our citizens seem more loyal than they have been in generations. Maximus was observing something that would become increasingly clear as Constantine's reign continued. The transformed cross wasn't just changing how Romans thought about religion. It was providing a new model for how political authority could function. Instead of ruling through fear and domination, Constantine was demonstrating that emperors could actually increase their power by serving their subjects' genuine needs. This approach attracted support from constituencies that traditional Roman politics had always ignored or oppressed. Women, slaves, the poor, and ethnic minorities began to see the imperial government as something that might actually serve their interests, rather than simply exploiting them. The cross had given Constantine access to sources of popular loyalty that previous emperors had never been able to tap. But perhaps most importantly, Constantine's embrace of the cross was attracting the attention of the empire's most capable administrators, military leaders, and intellectuals. People who had been searching for alternatives to the corruption and incompetence that had characterized late Roman government began to see Christian communities as models for how institutions could actually function effectively. Lactantius, who served as tutor to Constantine's son and became one of the most influential intellectuals of the early 4th century, articulated what many educated Romans were beginning to understand about the practical advantages of the transformed cross. "We have discovered," he wrote, "that the principles these Christians derive from their understanding of divine love actually produce better results in human affairs than the principles our philosophers derive from human reason alone. Their emphasis on truth-telling makes commerce more reliable. Their commitment to justice makes legal proceedings more fair. Their practice of forgiveness makes social relationships more stable." Lactantius was describing something that would prove crucial to the cross's eventual dominance as a global symbol. It wasn't just inspiring religious devotion or providing comfort to individuals. It was generating practical wisdom about how to organize human society in ways that actually worked better than traditional approaches. This practical effectiveness began to attract converts to Christianity, not primarily because they were convinced by theological arguments, but because they needed the social technologies that Christian communities had developed. As word spread throughout the empire that these communities had solved problems that had plagued human societies for millennia, people began adopting Christian practices even when they weren't fully committed to Christian beliefs. The transformation was accelerating beyond anything Constantine himself had anticipated when he first decided to carry the cross into battle. What had begun as a military expedient was becoming a comprehensive restructuring of Roman civilization around principles that would have been considered impossible just a few decades earlier. But the most dramatic developments were yet to come. As Constantine consolidated his control over the entire Roman Empire and began implementing his vision of Christian governance on an unprecedented scale, he would face challenges that would test whether the transformed cross could provide practical solutions to the kinds of massive administrative and social problems that had brought down previous civilizations. The symbol that had begun as Rome's ultimate expression of contempt for human dignity was about to become the foundation for the most ambitious experiment in human governance that the ancient world had ever attempted. The question that remained was whether the principles that had worked so well in small Christian communities could be scaled up to govern hundreds of millions of people across 3 continents. Constantine was about to find out, and his success or failure would determine whether the cross's journey from shame to hope would culminate in its establishment as the organizing symbol of an entirely new kind of civilization, or whether it would remain a beautiful ideal that couldn't survive contact with the realities of political power. The emperor who had gambled everything on an ancient symbol of defeat was about to discover whether that symbol contained enough practical wisdom to rebuild the Roman world from the ground up. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would establish patterns of thought and governance that would influence human development for the next 1,000 years. As Constantine began the most ambitious phase of his reign, he was carrying not just the hopes of Christian communities, but the possibility that human beings might actually be capable of creating political systems based on love rather than fear, service rather than domination, and hope rather than despair. The cross had completed its transformation from shame to hope in the hearts and minds of millions. Now it would face the ultimate test. Could it transform the very nature of political power itself, proving that even the mightiest empires could be rebuilt around symbols that celebrated human dignity rather than human degradation? The answer to that question would unfold in ways that even Constantine himself could never have anticipated, as the emperor discovered that embracing the cross meant far more than simply changing religious policies. It meant fundamentally reimagining what civilization itself could become. In 324 CE, Constantine achieved something that had eluded Roman rulers for decades. He reunified the entire empire under single authority, defeating his last rival and establishing himself as sole emperor over territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. But instead of celebrating this victory in the traditional Roman manner, with triumphal parades showcasing captured enemies and displays of military might, Constantine chose to mark his achievement by announcing the most audacious project in imperial history. He would build an entirely new capital city, one designed from the ground up to reflect the transformed understanding of power that the cross represented. This wouldn't be another Roman city with Christian buildings added to existing pagan temples. This would be something unprecedented, the world's first major city conceived and constructed as a physical embodiment of the principles that Christian communities had been developing for 3 centuries. The location Constantine chose for this revolutionary experiment was as symbolically significant as the project itself. The ancient Greek city of Byzantium sat at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the classical world of the past and whatever was coming next. Here, on the shores of the Bosphorus, Constantine would attempt to prove that the cross could provide the foundation for a new form of human civilization. But the real revolution wasn't in the city's location or even its architecture, remarkable though both would prove to be. The revolution was in how Constantine approached the fundamental questions of urban planning, social organization, and civic life. Every decision about how this new city would function reflected his growing understanding of what the transformed cross revealed about human nature and divine purpose. Traditional Roman cities were designed to showcase imperial power and reinforce social hierarchies. The Forum was positioned to display the emperor's glory. The amphitheatre was built to demonstrate Rome's dominance over its enemies, and the residential districts were arranged to reflect the rigid class distinctions that kept Roman society stable. But Constantine's new city, which would bear his name as Constantinople, was designed according to completely different principles. The centerpiece wasn't a temple to traditional gods or a palace celebrating imperial might, but a magnificent church dedicated to divine wisdom, Hagia Sophia. This wasn't just a building where Christians could worship. It was a statement about what Constantine believed was the ultimate source of political authority and social order. The emperor was declaring that human institutions worked best when they acknowledged their dependence on wisdom that transcended human understanding. Procopius of Gaza, the architect who helped design key sections of the new city, left detailed records of his conversations with Constantine about the principles guiding their work. These documents reveal an emperor who had moved far beyond simply tolerating Christianity to actively seeking ways to implement Christian insights about human relationships in the physical structure of urban life. The emperor instructed us to design spaces that would encourage the kind of community life he had observed in Christian gatherings, Procopius wrote. Instead of creating buildings that impressed viewers with their grandeur, we were asked to create environments that invited participation. Instead of monuments that celebrated individual achievement, we were commissioned to build structures that fostered collective worship and mutual service. This approach produced innovations that seemed minor but had profound implications for how people experience civic life. Public spaces were designed to encourage interaction between different social classes rather than segregating them. Markets were organized to ensure fair trading practices rather than maximizing profits for wealthy merchants. Housing was planned to provide dignity for ordinary citizens rather than just luxury for the elite. But perhaps most revolutionary of all, Constantine established legal and administrative systems that reflected the Christian understanding of human dignity that the cross had come to represent. Laws that had traditionally protected only the interests of Roman citizens were extended to slaves, foreigners, and other marginalized groups. Courts were restructured to emphasize justice and rehabilitation rather than punishment and deterrence. The results were so dramatically successful that they attracted attention from throughout the known world. Ambassadors from Persia, India, and even distant China began arriving in Constantinople to study what Constantine had accomplished. They came expecting to find another impressive display of imperial wealth and military power. Instead, they discovered something unprecedented, a major city that actually seemed to work for the benefit of all its inhabitants. Yazdegerd, the Persian ambassador, wrote detailed reports back to his king, describing what he observed during his stay in Constantinople. His letters reveal the astonishment of someone who had visited dozens of major cities throughout the ancient world, but had never seen anything like what Constantine had created. The Romans have always impressed us with their engineering skills and military organization, Yazdegerd wrote. But this new city demonstrates something far more remarkable. They appear to have solved the fundamental problems that plague all urban societies. Crime rates are lower than in any major city I have visited. Commerce flourishes without the corruption that usually accompanies large-scale trade. Most surprisingly, different ethnic and religious groups seem to coexist without the constant tensions that characterize other cosmopolitan centers. Yazdegerd was observing the practical fruits of Constantine's decision to build a civilization around the transformed cross. The symbol that had once represented ultimate social exclusion had become the foundation for the most inclusive urban society the ancient world had ever seen. But what made this achievement even more remarkable was that it was being accomplished without sacrificing efficiency or prosperity. Trade revenues in Constantinople exceeded those of Rome itself within a decade of the city's founding. The population grew so rapidly that Constantine had to expand the city's boundaries multiple times. Most importantly, the new capital was attracting the brightest minds and most capable administrators from throughout the empire, people who recognized that something genuinely innovative was happening there. Helena Augusta, Constantine's mother, had become one of the most influential figures in the new city, despite having no official political position. Her role revealed another way that the transformed cross was reshaping Roman concepts of authority and leadership. Instead of gaining power through military conquest or political manipulation, Helena had earned influence through her commitment to the charitable and educational institutions that were becoming central features of Constantinople's civic life. Her projects included hospitals that provided medical care regardless of patients' ability to pay, schools that educated children from all social backgrounds, and workshops that trained former slaves in valuable trades that could support them as free citizens. These weren't just charitable gestures, they were systematic attempts to address the root causes of social problems that had plagued urban societies throughout history. The Empress Mother has shown us something remarkable, wrote Eusebius of Caesarea, the court historian who documented these developments. She has demonstrated that true authority comes not from the power to command others, but from the wisdom to serve them effectively. Her influence throughout the city is greater than that of many senators, yet she holds no official office and commands no legions. Helena's example was being replicated throughout Constantinople as the transformed cross inspired new forms of leadership that Roman society had never seen before. Bishops were functioning as social workers, organizing relief efforts and conflict resolution services. Wealthy merchants were redirecting their resources toward community development projects rather than personal luxury. Even government officials were beginning to understand their roles as opportunities for service rather than personal advancement. This transformation of political culture was producing results that impressed even skeptical observers. Economic productivity was increasing as social tensions decreased. Innovation flourished as people felt secure enough to take risks and pursue long-term projects. International relations improved as foreign governments recognized that Constantine's empire was becoming more reliable and trustworthy than traditional Roman diplomacy had ever been. But perhaps the most significant development was happening among ordinary citizens who were discovering that the cross offered them something that traditional Roman culture had never provided: a sense of meaningful participation in something larger than their individual lives. Marcus Claudius Tiberius was a former soldier who had settled in Constantinople after completing his military service. His letters to friends in other parts of the empire reveal how profoundly the city's Christian-inspired culture was affecting people who had grown up under traditional Roman values. "I spent honor was to die gloriously in battle for the emperor's glory," Marcus wrote. But 20 years in the legions believing that the highest in this new city, I have discovered forms of service that seem more valuable than military children of former slaves, helping to build homes for refugees, and participating in community councils that actually solve problems rather than just debating them. Marcus was describing something that was happening throughout Constantinople. Ordinary people were finding ways to contribute to the common good that made their individual valor. "I spend my days teaching reading to the lives feel significant and purposeful." The cross had given them access to a story about human existence that made even the most humble forms of service feel cosmically important. This psychological transformation was having practical effects that rippled throughout the empire. Cities throughout the Roman world began sending delegations to Constantinople to study its innovations and adapt them to their own circumstances. Provincial governors started implementing policies based on what they observed working in the capital. Even barbarian tribes beyond the empire's borders began expressing interest in the principles that seemed to be producing such remarkable results. The cross was becoming more than a religious symbol or even a model for effective governance. It was becoming a template for human civilization itself, offering blueprints for social organization that seemed to work better than anything humanity had previously developed. But Constantine's most ambitious project was yet to come. Having proven that Christian principles could transform urban life, he began to consider whether they might provide solutions to the larger challenges facing human societies. The cycles of war and conquest that had dominated international relations, the economic inequalities that had plagued every known civilization, and the ethnic and cultural conflicts that seemed to make peaceful coexistence impossible. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing together Christian leaders from throughout the empire to address theological disputes that were threatening to fragment the movement just as it was achieving unprecedented influence. But the council's significance extended far beyond religious matters. It represented the first attempt to create international institutions based on the principles of dialogue, consensus building, and mutual respect that Christian communities had been developing. The process Constantine established at Nicaea would become a model for diplomatic problem solving that influenced Western political development for centuries to come. Instead of resolving disputes through military force or political intimidation, the council used structured debate, careful examination of evidence, and patient negotiation to reach agreements that all participants could accept. Bishop Hosius of Cordova, who helped facilitate the council's proceedings, documented the innovative methods they developed for managing complex disagreements among strong-willed leaders from diverse cultural backgrounds. His records reveal techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for their time and would later influence everything from parliamentary procedure to international law. "We have learned," Hosius wrote, "that even the most passionate disagreements can be resolved peacefully when all parties commit themselves to seeking truth rather than defending their egos. The emperor has shown us that authority exercised through service rather than domination actually produces more lasting and beneficial results than traditional approaches to leadership." The success of the Council of Nicaea encouraged Constantine to apply similar principles to secular governance, leading to innovations in imperial administration that made Roman government more effective than it had been in centuries. Provincial rebellions decreased as local leaders found themselves included in decision-making processes, rather than simply receiving orders from distant authorities. Economic development accelerated as policies were crafted through consultation with people who actually understood regional conditions and needs. Most remarkably, The empire's relationship with neighboring powers began to improve as Constantine applied Christian principles to international diplomacy. Instead of viewing foreign relations as zero-sum competitions, where one side's gain required the other's loss, he began exploring possibilities for mutual benefit and cooperative problem-solving. The Persian king, Shapur II, who had been preparing for war against Rome when Constantine came to power, found himself instead negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchange programs with an empire that seemed genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence. His correspondence with Constantine reveals the bewilderment of a traditional ruler trying to understand this new approach to international relations. "I have spent my entire life preparing to defend my kingdom against Roman aggression," Shapur wrote. "But now I find myself working with Roman officials to address problems that affect both our peoples. This Christian emperor seems to believe that both our kingdoms can prosper simultaneously, an idea that contradicts everything I was taught about the nature of political power." Shapur was encountering something that would become increasingly evident as Constantine's reign continued. The transformed cross wasn't just changing how Romans understood their own society, but was providing a model for international relationships that seemed to offer genuine alternatives to the cycles of conflict that had characterized human history. By 330 CE, when Constantinople was formally dedicated as the empire's new capital, the cross had completed a journey that defied every expectation about how symbols evolve and influence human development. It had risen from representing ultimate shame and social exclusion to becoming the foundation for the most successful experiment in inclusive governance that the ancient world had ever witnessed. But the story was far from over. Constantine's achievements had proven that Christian principles could transform political institutions and international relations, but they had also raised new questions about whether these innovations could survive contact with the fundamental challenges that had brought down every previous civilization. Could the cross's message of love and service provide practical solutions to the economic pressures that had always threatened social stability? Could its emphasis on human dignity and mutual respect offer workable alternatives to the ethnic and cultural conflicts that had fragmented every diverse society? Could its vision of divine purpose and ultimate meaning help human beings find sustainable responses to the existential questions that had driven so much historical destruction? These questions would be answered not by Constantine himself, but by the generations of leaders and ordinary citizens who would inherit the civilization he had begun to build around the transformed cross. Their successes and failures would determine whether this remarkable symbol would continue its rise to become a truly global force for hope and human flourishing, or whether it would join the long list of beautiful ideas that proved unworkable when tested by the full complexity of human nature and social organization. The cross had proven it could transform individuals, communities, cities, and even empires. The ultimate test would be whether it contained enough practical wisdom to guide human civilization through the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would require not just good intentions and noble ideals, but sophisticated understanding of economics, politics, psychology, and the intricate dynamics of cultural change. Constantine had opened the door to possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Whether humanity would prove capable of walking through that door and building something truly unprecedented on the other side would depend on discoveries yet to be made about the relationship between spiritual insight and practical wisdom, between individual transformation and social progress, between ancient symbols and contemporary challenges. The journey from shame to hope was complete. But the journey from hope to lasting human flourishing had only just begun, and at its center remained that simple wooden cross, still carrying within itself all the mysteries of human suffering and divine love that had first captured the imagination of a small group of believers in the backwaters of the Roman Empire so many centuries before. The decades following Constantine's death in 337 CE would reveal whether the extraordinary transformation he had initiated could survive the transition of power that had destroyed so many previous attempts at imperial reform. The cross had proven its ability to inspire individual conversion, build resilient communities, and even reshape the governance of the world's greatest empire. But now it faced perhaps its most challenging test. Could the principles it represented create institutions strong enough to outlast the charismatic leader who had championed them? The answer would emerge through a series of crises that tested every aspect of what Constantine had built around the transformed cross. His sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, inherited an empire that was more prosperous and stable than Rome had been in generations. But they also inherited something far more complex and fragile, a new understanding of imperial authority that depended not just on military might and administrative efficiency, but on moral credibility and spiritual authenticity. The first test came almost immediately. Traditional Roman elites, who had grudgingly accepted Constantine's innovations while he lived, began pushing for a return to more familiar forms of governance once the great emperor was gone. Senator Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the famous Republican hero, led a faction that viewed Constantine's Christian-inspired reforms as temporary aberrations that could now be safely abandoned. "We honored the late emperor's religious preferences out of loyalty to his person," Brutus declared to the Senate. "But we need not bind ourselves forever to experiments that contradict the tested wisdom of our ancestors." Rome became great through strength, discipline, and respect for traditional values, not through this foreign philosophy of weakness disguised as virtue. Brutus represented a significant constituency throughout the empire. Romans who had accepted Constantine's changes as the price of political stability, but who had never been convinced that Christian principles offered superior alternatives to traditional Roman methods. These people weren't necessarily opposed to the cross as a religious symbol, but they questioned whether it could provide practical guidance for the hard decisions that imperial governance required. Their concerns weren't entirely unreasonable. Constantine's reign had coincided with a period of relative external peace and internal prosperity that had made his idealistic policies easier to implement. But empires always faced challenges that tested whether their governing principles could handle extreme stress. Economic crises that threatened social order, military threats that required decisive action, and cultural conflicts that strained the bonds holding diverse populations together. The first such crisis emerged in 350 CE, when the empire faced a serious barbarian invasion along the Rhine frontier. Germanic tribes, emboldened by reports of Roman weakness following Constantine's death, launched coordinated attacks that threatened to overrun the empire's northwestern provinces. The crisis demanded exactly the kind of brutal military response that traditional Roman leaders had always provided, but that seemed to contradict the Christian emphasis on peace and reconciliation. Emperor Constantius II found himself facing an impossible choice. If he responded with traditional Roman ruthlessness, he would undermine everything his father had built around the transformed cross. But if he held back in the name of Christian mercy, he might lose territories that had been Roman for centuries and expose millions of citizens to barbarian violence. His solution revealed something crucial about how the cross was continuing to evolve as a practical guide for governance. Instead of simply choosing between traditional Roman methods and Christian ideals, Constantius began developing new approaches that drew on both traditions while transcending the limitations of each. Rather than launching immediate military campaigns aimed at crushing the barbarian tribes, Constantius first sent diplomatic missions to understand what was driving their aggression. His envoys discovered that many of the attacks were motivated not by pure hostility, but by desperate circumstances in the barbarian homelands. Failed harvests, pressure from other tribes moving westward, and internal conflicts that were displacing entire populations. This intelligence allowed Constantius to design responses that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Some tribes were offered opportunities to settle peacefully in underpopulated Roman territories, where they could contribute their labor and military skills to imperial defense. Others were provided with trade agreements that gave them access to Roman resources without requiring violent conquest. Still, others were helped to resolve their internal conflicts through mediation rather than warfare. The military campaigns that did prove necessary were conducted according to principles that would have seemed bizarre to earlier Roman commanders. Enemy combatants were treated according to strict codes of conduct that protected non-combatants and sought to minimize casualties on both sides. Captured leaders were offered opportunities for negotiated settlements rather than automatic execution. Victory celebrations emphasized successful resolution of conflicts rather than domination over defeated enemies. General Flavius Aetius, who commanded Roman forces during these campaigns, initially struggled with orders that seemed to contradict everything he had learned about effective military leadership. His private correspondence reveals a professional soldier gradually discovering that Christian-inspired approaches to warfare could actually produce better strategic results than traditional methods. "I confess that I doubted the emperor's methods when he first explained them to me," Aetius wrote to a colleague. "It seemed obvious that showing mercy to enemies would encourage further aggression, and that treating barbarians with respect would be interpreted as weakness. But I have now observed that our new approaches actually create more lasting peace than our old methods ever achieved." Aetius was documenting something that would prove crucial to the cross's continued influence. Christian principles weren't just moral guidelines that good people ought to follow, regardless of practical consequences. They were actually more effective tools for achieving the goals that traditional Roman methods had pursued less successfully. The barbarian campaigns of the 300s and 50s established patterns that would characterize Roman foreign relations for generations to come. Instead of viewing international relations as perpetual competitions between irreconcilable enemies, imperial policy began to emphasize the possibility of transforming adversaries into allies through patient diplomacy and genuine attention to their legitimate needs. But perhaps more importantly, these campaigns demonstrated that the cross could provide practical guidance for the most challenging decisions imperial leaders faced, even when those decisions involved life and death questions of war and peace. The symbol wasn't just inspiring individual conversions or building charitable institutions, it was reshaping how the Roman Empire understood its role in the broader world. This transformation became even more evident in how Constantius handled domestic challenges that tested the inclusivity that had become central to Constantinople's appeal. As the empire's population became increasingly diverse, with growing communities of former barbarians, freed slaves, and immigrants from throughout the known world, traditional Roman concepts of citizenship and social order came under enormous strain. The old system had maintained stability by keeping different groups rigidly separated and clearly ranked in hierarchical relationships that everyone understood. But the cross's message about universal human dignity made these distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain, while its emphasis on community building created pressure for more inclusive approaches to social organization. Tensions came to a head in 355 CE when riots erupted in several major cities as different ethnic and religious communities clashed over economic opportunities, political representation, and cultural recognition. Traditional Roman responses to such unrest had always involved swift military suppression, followed by punitive measures designed to deter future disturbances. But Constantius chose a different approach that reflected his growing understanding of how the cross's principles could be applied to complex social problems. Instead of simply restoring order through force, he launched comprehensive investigations into the underlying causes of the conflicts and began implementing systematic reforms designed to address legitimate grievances while maintaining social cohesion. The process he developed became a model for conflict resolution that influenced imperial policy for centuries. Teams of investigators, including both government officials and respected community leaders, conducted thorough examinations of disputed issues. Public hearings allowed different groups to present their concerns and proposals for solutions. Negotiation sessions sought to develop compromises that addressed everyone's essential needs while respecting established legal frameworks. Most innovatively, Constantius established permanent institutions designed to prevent future conflicts by ensuring that all communities had ongoing opportunities to participate in decisions that affected their lives. Mixed councils with representatives from different ethnic and religious groups were given real authority over local issues. Appeals processes allowed individuals to seek redress for unfair treatment, regardless of their social status. Regular forums created spaces for dialogue between communities that might otherwise remain isolated from each other. Bishop Ambrose of Milan, who participated in several of these conflict resolution processes, documented their remarkable effectiveness in his correspondence with church leaders throughout the empire. His letters reveal how Christian principles were being translated into practical tools for managing the kind of diversity that had destroyed previous civilizations. What we have witnessed, Ambrose wrote, is the transformation of human nature itself through the power of divine love, working through earthly institutions. People who seemed incapable of coexistence have learned to collaborate productively. Communities that appeared to be natural enemies have discovered common interests. Most remarkably, these changes seem to be creating more prosperity and security for everyone involved, not just moral satisfaction for idealistic observers. Ambrose was describing something that would become increasingly evident as these new approaches spread throughout the empire. The cross wasn't just changing how people thought about social relationships, but was generating practical technologies for managing human diversity that worked better than anything previous civilizations had developed. The success of these innovations attracted attention from far beyond the Roman Empire's borders. Diplomatic missions from China, India, and Ethiopia began arriving in Constantinople specifically to study Roman methods for managing multi-ethnic societies. Foreign rulers who had always viewed diversity as a source of weakness and instability were intrigued by reports of an empire that seemed to be growing stronger precisely because of its inclusiveness. Emperor Wu of the Northern Wei dynasty sent a particularly detailed embassy to investigate Roman social policies. His ambassadors spent months observing imperial institutions and interviewing citizens from different backgrounds about their experiences living under Christian-influenced governance. Their final report, preserved in Chinese historical records, reveals how profoundly the cross's influence was impressing sophisticated observers from entirely different cultural traditions. The Romans have accomplished something that contradicts everything we believed possible about human nature and political organization, the embassy reported. They have created a society where people from different tribes, religions, and social backgrounds not only coexist peacefully, but actually cooperate to solve common problems. Most remarkably, this cooperation seems to be making their empire stronger and more prosperous, rather than weaker and more chaotic. The Chinese observers were particularly impressed by the economic benefits of Roman inclusiveness. Instead of the inefficiencies that traditional political theory predicted would result from giving different groups equal treatment, they found thriving commercial networks that benefited from the diverse skills and connections that different communities brought to imperial society. Jewish merchants were using their international contacts to expand Roman trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Former barbarian warriors were applying their military expertise to imperial defense while contributing their cultural knowledge to diplomatic relations with tribes beyond the frontier. Freed slaves were developing innovations in agriculture and manufacturing that increased productivity throughout the empire. But perhaps most significantly, the Chinese embassy documented how the cross was inspiring forms of social cooperation that seemed to transcend the ethnic and cultural loyalties that had always fragmented diverse societies. People who had grown up thinking of themselves primarily as members of particular tribes or religious communities were beginning to develop additional identities as citizens of an empire that valued their contributions regardless of their backgrounds. This psychological transformation was having practical effects that rippled throughout imperial society. Military units that included soldiers from many different ethnic backgrounds were displaying unprecedented levels of cohesion and effectiveness. Commercial ventures that brought together partners from different cultural traditions were generating innovations that none of the participants could have developed independently. Educational institutions that welcomed students regardless of their social origins were producing scholars and administrators whose diverse perspectives enhanced their problem-solving abilities. The cross had become more than a religious symbol or even a guide for individual moral behavior. It was functioning as the organizing principle for a new form of human civilization that seemed capable of integrating diversity in ways that strengthened rather than weakened social bonds. But the most ambitious test of these innovations was yet to come. As the 4th century progressed, the Roman Empire would face challenges that would determine whether the cross's influence could survive the kinds of existential threats that had brought down every previous civilization. Economic pressures that threatened the foundations of social order, military challenges that tested the limits of imperial defense capabilities, and cultural changes that strained the bonds holding even the most successful societies together. The transformation from shame to hope was complete, but the transformation from hope to lasting civilization was entering its most critical phase. Everything Constantine had built around the cross would soon face trials that would reveal whether this remarkable symbol contained enough practical wisdom to guide human beings through the challenges that had always defeated their most ambitious attempts at creating just and sustainable societies. The stage was set for the ultimate test of whether symbols could actually reshape the world, or whether the world's harsh realities would ultimately overwhelm even the most inspiring ideals. The cross had proven its power to transform individuals, communities, and even empires. Now it would discover whether it could transform the trajectory of human history itself. As the 4th century drew toward its close, the believers who had first glimpsed the possibility of finding hope in an instrument of shame could never have imagined how far their transformed symbol would travel. But they also could not have anticipated the new challenges that success would bring, or the discoveries that lay ahead about the relationship between spiritual insight and practical wisdom in the ongoing human quest for meaning, justice, and lasting peace. The cross stood at the threshold of its greatest test, carrying within itself all the hopes and fears of a civilization that had dared to believe that even the most despised symbols could become sources of universal hope. What happened next would determine whether that faith was justified by the realities of human nature and historical development, or whether it represented one more beautiful dream that would ultimately yield to the harsh facts of political power and social competition. The answer would unfold in ways that would surprise everyone who thought they understood what the cross represented, revealing new depths of meaning that had been hidden even from those who had devoted their lives to exploring its transformative power. By the year 380 CE, something unprecedented was unfolding across the Mediterranean world. The cross, which had begun its journey as Rome's most feared symbol of degradation, was now guiding the daily decisions of millions of people who had never experienced the terror of crucifixion firsthand. A new generation was coming of age that knew the cross only as a source of hope, community, and practical wisdom for navigating life's challenges. But this generational shift created unexpected complications. Young Romans who had grown up under Christian influence often lacked the historical perspective to understand just how revolutionary their worldview actually was. To them, the idea that political authority should serve ordinary citizens seemed natural and obvious. The notion that different ethnic groups could cooperate productively appeared to be simple common sense. The belief that suffering could be transformed into something meaningful felt like basic human wisdom. This innocence, beautiful though it was, left them unprepared for the resistance they would encounter as they tried to extend Christian principles into areas of human experience that previous generations had barely begun to explore. The cross had proven its power to transform individuals, communities, and governmental institutions. But could it provide guidance for the intricate economic relationships that determined whether entire populations prospered or starved? Could it offer solutions to the technological challenges that shaped how people lived and worked? Could it help human beings navigate the complex moral questions that arose as their societies became more sophisticated and interconnected? The answers to these questions would emerge through the experiences of people like Aurelius Marcus Valerius, a young Roman engineer who represented everything that Constantine's revolution had made possible. Born in Constantinople in 360 CE, Aurelius had grown up taking for granted that his technical skills should serve the common good, rather than merely advancing his personal career. His education had emphasized not just mathematical precision and mechanical ingenuity, but also ethical reflection about the purposes his innovations would serve. When Aurelius was commissioned to design aqueducts for newly established settlements along the Danube frontier, he approached the project with assumptions that would have seemed bizarre to earlier Roman engineers. Instead of simply calculating the most efficient routes for moving water from sources to destinations, he spent months studying how different communities used water and what their varying needs revealed about human dignity and social cooperation. His investigations revealed that traditional Roman water systems, impressive though they were technically, had always reinforced social hierarchies by providing abundant supplies to wealthy neighborhoods while rationing access for poorer communities. Public baths, private fountains, and agricultural irrigation were distributed according to political influence rather than human need, creating constant sources of tension and inequality. But Aurelius had been trained to see engineering problems through the lens of Christian understanding about human relationships. His aqueduct designs prioritized reliability and fairness over impressive displays of technical virtuosity. He developed distribution systems that ensured adequate supplies for everyone before providing luxury access for anyone. He created maintenance protocols that engaged local communities as partners rather than treating them as passive beneficiaries of imperial generosity. The results were remarkable not just for their technical excellence, but for their social effects. Communities that had been plagued by water-related conflicts for generations found themselves cooperating on maintenance projects that required skills and labor from people with different backgrounds and interests. Former enemies discovered common ground in their shared dependence on systems that worked only when everyone contributed to their upkeep. Aurelius documented these developments in detailed reports that circulated throughout the empire and influenced how other engineers approached their work. His writings reveal someone who understood that technical competence and moral wisdom were not separate disciplines, but complementary aspects of effective problem-solving. "We have learned," he wrote, "that engineering projects succeed or fail not just based on their mathematical precision, but on whether they reflect accurate understanding of human nature and social relationships. The cross has taught us that true strength comes from service, and this principle applies to aqueducts just as surely as it applies to governance or military strategy." Aurelius was part of a generation that was discovering how Christian insights could transform not just religious practice and political institutions, but the entire range of human activities that shaped daily life. Similar innovations were emerging in agriculture, manufacturing, commerce, and education as people trained in Christian communities applied their understanding of the cross to practical challenges that previous generations had addressed through purely secular methods. The economic implications of these developments were becoming increasingly evident to observers throughout the known world. Marcus Claudius Tacitus, a wealthy merchant from Alexandria, had initially been skeptical of claims that Christian principles could improve business practices. His family had built their fortune through traditional Roman commercial methods that emphasized competitive advantage, strategic information control, and ruthless exploitation of market opportunities. But as Tacitus expanded his trading networks into regions where Christian communities were becoming dominant, he encountered business practices that challenged everything he thought he knew about how commerce actually worked. Christian merchants seemed to prioritize long-term relationships over short-term profits. They shared information that could have given them competitive advantages. They treated employees and business partners as colleagues rather than subordinates or rivals. Most puzzling of all, these apparently naive approaches to business were generating better financial results than the supposedly sophisticated methods Tacitus had learned from his father and grandfather. Christian trading networks were more reliable because they were built on trust rather than fear. Christian businesses were more innovative because they encouraged input from workers at every level. Christian commercial relationships were more sustainable because they sought mutual benefit rather than zero-sum victories. Tacitus began experimenting with these alternative approaches, initially as calculated attempts to improve his own profitability. But he soon discovered that adopting Christian business practices required more fundamental changes in his thinking than he had anticipated. He couldn't simply add techniques like honesty and fairness to his existing repertoire of commercial strategies. The cross demanded a complete rethinking of what business success actually meant and how it could be achieved. I began this investigation hoping to learn new methods for increasing my wealth, Tacitus wrote to a business partner, but I have discovered that the Christians are asking more fundamental questions about what wealth is for and how it should be pursued. They have convinced me that the most profitable businesses are those that create genuine value for everyone they touch, not just for their owners. Tacitus was experiencing something that was happening throughout the Roman commercial world as the cross's influence expanded into economic relationships. Business leaders who had been trained to think of commerce as warfare conducted by other means were discovering that cooperation and mutual service could actually produce better results than competition and exploitation. These discoveries were having implications that extended far beyond individual businesses or even entire industries. Regional economies where Christian principles were becoming dominant were displaying greater stability, higher productivity, and more equitable distribution of prosperity than areas that continue to operate according to traditional Roman economic assumptions. The province of Gaul provided a particularly striking example of these dynamics. Under traditional Roman administration, Gallic communities had been systematically exploited to provide resources for the imperial centre while receiving minimal investment in local development. Agricultural production was organised to maximise tribute payments rather than local food security. Mineral extraction enriched Roman elites while impoverishing the communities where the work was actually done. Trade relationships were structured to benefit Roman merchants at the expense of local producers. But as Christian communities gained influence throughout Gaul, these extractive relationships began to give way to more collaborative economic arrangements. Imperial administrators trained in Christian communities started viewing their role as service to local populations rather than extraction of resources for distant authorities. Roman merchants began establishing partnerships with Gallic producers that shared profits more equitably. Investment in local infrastructure increased as imperial policy recognized that provincial prosperity ultimately strengthened the entire empire. The results were so impressive that they attracted attention from throughout the Roman world and beyond. Provincial revenues increased as local economies became more productive. Military recruitment improved as Gallic communities developed stronger loyalties to an empire that served their interests. Cultural tensions decreased as different groups found common ground in shared economic projects. But perhaps most significantly, the Gallic experiments demonstrated that Christian principles could provide practical alternatives to the exploitative economic relationships that had always characterized imperial governance. The cross wasn't just inspiring individual moral behavior or building charitable institutions. It was generating new technologies for organizing human productive activities that seemed to work better than anything previous civilizations had developed. Emperor Theodosius, who came to power in 379 CE, recognized that these economic innovations represented opportunities for strengthening the empire in ways that traditional Roman methods could never achieve. His policies systematically extended Christian-inspired economic practices throughout imperial territories, creating what amounted to a comprehensive alternative to classical Roman approaches to wealth creation and distribution. Theodosius established imperial workshops that operated according to Christian principles of fair wages, safe working conditions, and shared decision-making between supervisors and workers. He implemented tax policies that encouraged charitable giving and community development projects. He created legal frameworks that protected small producers from exploitation by large landowners and merchants. Most innovatively, he began treating imperial provinces as partners in a collaborative enterprise rather than subjects of extractive domination. Provincial leaders were invited to participate in policy discussions that affected their regions. Local communities were given greater authority over their own economic development. Resources extracted from provinces were increasingly reinvested in local projects that served provincial populations. These policies produced results that vindicated Theodosius's confidence in Christian economic principles. Imperial revenues increased as provincial economies became more productive and local populations developed stronger loyalties to imperial authority. Trade networks expanded as different regions specialized in areas where they had competitive advantages while cooperating to meet their collective needs. Innovation accelerated as communities throughout the empire contributed their distinctive knowledge and skills to solving common problems. But the most remarkable development was the emergence of economic relationships that transcended traditional boundaries between the Roman Empire and neighboring civilizations. As Christian merchants established trading networks that emphasized mutual benefit rather than exploitative advantage, they began developing commercial relationships with Persian, Indian, and Chinese businesses that had previously been considered natural enemies or competitors. The results challenged fundamental assumptions about international economics that had shaped imperial policy for centuries. Instead of viewing foreign trade as a source of strategic vulnerability that required military protection, Christian merchants were demonstrating that genuine partnerships with foreign businesses could actually enhance imperial security by creating shared interests in maintaining peaceful relationships. Nestorius of Antioch, a Christian merchant who established some of the earliest trading partnerships with Persian businesses, documented how these relationships were reshaping international commerce throughout the eastern Mediterranean. His correspondence reveals someone who understood that economic cooperation could be a more effective tool for promoting imperial interests than military intimidation or diplomatic manipulation. "We have discovered," Nestorius wrote, "that our Persian partners are more reliable business associates than many Roman merchants who view every transaction as an opportunity to gain advantage over their colleagues. When people understand that their prosperity depends on their partner's success, they become genuinely committed to solving problems together rather than simply pursuing their individual interests." Nestorius was describing economic relationships that reflected the same principles of mutual service and shared responsibility that had transformed Roman domestic policy under Christian influence. But he was applying these principles to international commerce in ways that were creating unprecedented levels of cooperation between civilizations that had traditionally viewed each other as existential threats. These developments were being observed with fascination and growing concern by political leaders throughout the known world. The Roman Empire's combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and economic innovation was making it increasingly attractive to populations throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa who were comparing imperial governance with what their own rulers provided. King Shapur III of Persia found himself facing domestic pressure to adopt Roman-style policies as his subjects learned about the prosperity and security that Christian-inspired governance was providing for Roman citizens. His correspondence with court advisors reveals a traditional ruler struggling to understand how his most dangerous rival had somehow transformed itself into a model that his own people wanted him to emulate. Our spies report that Roman citizens enjoy greater personal security, more economic opportunity, and more meaningful participation in governance than our own subjects, Shapur wrote to his chief minister. If these reports are accurate, we face a threat more dangerous than any military campaign. The possibility that our people will conclude that Roman rule would serve their interests better than Persian rule. Shapur was confronting something that would become increasingly common throughout the ancient world as the cross's influence continued to expand. Traditional rulers discovering that their methods of governance were becoming obsolete not because they were being defeated militarily, but because they were being surpassed in terms of the quality of life they could provide for their subjects. This dynamic was creating pressures for political reform throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, as rulers recognized that they needed to match Roman achievements in order to maintain their own legitimacy. Some, like the Ethiopian Emperor Ezana, responded by adopting Christian principles directly and implementing governance reforms modeled on Roman innovations. Others, like various Germanic tribal leaders, began negotiating for closer relationships with the Roman Empire that would give their people access to Roman institutions and economic opportunities. But perhaps most significantly, some rulers began developing their own alternatives to Christian-inspired governance that drew on their distinctive cultural traditions while addressing the same human needs that Roman policies were meeting so effectively. These experiments in alternative approaches to inclusive governance created a kind of positive competition that accelerated political innovation throughout the known world. The cross had become more than a religious symbol, or even a guide for Roman imperial policy. It was functioning as a catalyst for civilizational development that was inspiring human societies throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa to explore new possibilities for organizing political, economic, and social relationships in ways that better serve their people's fundamental needs. Yet, as the 4th century drew toward its close, perceptive observers were beginning to recognize that the cross's very success was creating new challenges that would test whether its principles could continue to provide practical guidance as human societies became more complex and interconnected. The symbol that had risen from shame to hope was now being asked to guide humanity through questions that no previous generation had needed to address. Could Christian principles provide wisdom for managing the kind of economic prosperity that was making some communities wealthy beyond anything previous civilizations had achieved? Could the cross offer guidance for navigating the cultural exchanges that were bringing different civilizations into closer contact than ever before? Could its message about human dignity and divine purpose help people find meaning in lives that were becoming more comfortable, but also more complicated than their ancestors had ever experienced? These questions would shape the next phase of the cross's remarkable journey from ancient symbol to global force for human flourishing. The answers would determine whether this extraordinary emblem could continue to provide practical wisdom for humanity's ongoing quest to create societies worthy of the dignity it proclaimed was inherent in every human life. The stage was set for discoveries that would reveal new dimensions of meaning hidden within the simple wooden cross that had begun this incredible journey in the backwater provinces of an empire that no longer existed. What lay ahead would test not just the cross's power to inspire hope, but its capacity to guide human beings through challenges that would require all the wisdom they could gather about the relationship between spiritual insight and practical action in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The 4th century was ending, but the story of how the cross would continue to reshape human civilization was just entering its most ambitious and consequential phase. As the 5th century dawned, the cross faced a test that would have seemed impossible to the first believers who glimpsed hope in Rome's instrument of shame. The symbol that had transformed individuals, communities, and even empires was now being asked to provide guidance for something unprecedented in human history. A truly global civilization that connected peoples across vast continents who had never before needed to understand each other's deepest values and assumptions. The challenge emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Roman merchants following Christian principles had established trading relationships that stretched from Britain to India, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Nubia. These weren't just commercial exchanges, but cultural encounters that brought together world views that had developed in complete isolation from each other for thousands of years. In the great port city of Alexandria, a typical marketplace now included Ethiopian spice traders, Chinese silk merchants, Germanic amber dealers, and Indian cotton suppliers, all conducting business according to principles of honesty and mutual benefit that the cross had inspired. But as these diverse communities spent more time together, they began discovering that their different cultural backgrounds had produced radically different approaches to fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the meaning of existence itself. Priscilla of Caesarea was a Christian merchant who specialized in facilitating these cross-cultural business relationships. Her private journals document the fascinating challenges that arose when people trained in Christian communities encountered trading partners whose entire worldviews had been shaped by completely different spiritual and philosophical traditions. Yesterday, I spent 3 hours trying to negotiate a simple contract between a Roman cloth manufacturer and a Chinese silk producer, Priscilla wrote. The Roman, trained in our Christian communities, assumed that both parties should prioritize fairness and long-term relationship building. The Chinese merchant, following his Confucian training, believed that harmony required strict adherence to traditional hierarchical relationships. Neither could understand why the other's approach seemed so obviously wrong. Priscilla was documenting something that was happening throughout the expanding networks of international commerce. The Cross's message about human dignity and mutual service was encountering other sophisticated traditions that had developed their own profound insights about how people should treat each other. The result wasn't simple conflict, but complex conversations that challenged everyone involved to think more deeply about their most basic assumptions. These encounters were particularly intense when Christian merchants met Buddhist traders from the eastern reaches of the Silk Routes. Both traditions emphasize compassion, service to others, and the possibility of finding meaning through transcending selfish concerns. But they had developed these insights through completely different historical experiences and expressed them in ways that often seemed contradictory despite their underlying similarities. Marcus Aurelius Serenity, a Christian merchant from Constantinople, spent 2 years living in Buddhist communities along the Silk Route to better understand his trading partners' perspectives. His letters home reveal someone struggling to comprehend how two traditions that seem to share so many values could approach practical questions so differently. The Buddhist merchants I work with display the same commitment to honesty and fairness that we associate with Christian business practices, Marcus wrote. But when I ask them about the source of these values, they speak of cosmic principles and universal compassion rather than divine love revealed through the cross. Most puzzling of all, their methods often produce the same results as ours, even though their reasoning seems completely different. Marcus was encountering something that would become increasingly important as the cross's influence continued to expand. Other wisdom traditions had independently discovered many of the same practical insights about human relationships that Christian communities had derived from their understanding of divine love. This wasn't threatening the uniqueness of the cross's message, but it was revealing that the symbol's influence was part of a larger pattern of human spiritual development that transcended any single cultural tradition. The implications of these discoveries were becoming evident to Christian leaders throughout the empire, who were being asked to provide guidance for believers engaged in these cross-cultural encounters. Bishop John Chrysostom of Constantinople found himself counseling Christian merchants, diplomats, and scholars who were struggling to understand how their faith related to the profound wisdom they were encountering in other traditions. We must recognize, Chrysostom wrote in a letter to Christian communities throughout the Eastern Empire, that the God we worship through the cross is the same God who created all peoples and planted seeds of divine wisdom in every human heart. When we encounter truth and beauty in other traditions, We are not discovering alternatives to Christian faith, but evidence of how extensively divine love has been working throughout human history. Chrysostom was articulating a response to cultural diversity that would prove crucial to the cross's continued influence. Rather than viewing other wisdom traditions as threats to Christian uniqueness, Christian communities could understand them as evidence of the universal scope of divine love that the cross had revealed. This approach allowed Christians to engage respectfully with other cultures while maintaining their conviction that the cross provided distinctive insights about the nature of divine love and human purpose. But these theological developments were having practical implications that extended far beyond religious discussions. As Christian merchants, administrators, and scholars learned to appreciate wisdom from other traditions, they began incorporating useful insights from different cultures into their own approaches to problem solving. The result was a kind of hybrid wisdom that combined Christian principles with practical knowledge gathered from throughout the known world. This synthesis was particularly evident in the field of medicine, where Christian physicians were encountering healing traditions from India, China, and other civilizations that had developed sophisticated understanding of human physiology and therapeutic techniques. Rather than rejecting these foreign approaches as incompatible with Christian faith, many physicians began exploring how different healing traditions might complement each other. Basil of Caesarea established what may have been the world's first international medical school, where Christian physicians studied alongside healers from throughout the known world. His curriculum combined Christian insights about the spiritual dimensions of healing with practical techniques drawn from Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Egyptian medical traditions. We have discovered, Basil wrote, that the same divine love that inspired our understanding of the cross has also guided healers throughout the world to develop methods for relieving human suffering. Our task is not to choose between Christian and foreign approaches to medicine, but to learn how different traditions can work together to serve the healing purposes that God intends. Basil's medical school became a model for educational institutions throughout the Christian world that were grappling with how to maintain their distinctive identity while benefiting from the wisdom that global cultural exchange was making available. The cross wasn't threatened by exposure to other traditions. It was being enriched as Christian communities learned to see their symbol's message reflected in the diverse ways that human beings had sought to understand divine love and serve human flourishing. Similar developments were occurring in agriculture, architecture, military strategy, and governance as Christian communities incorporated useful innovations from other cultures while maintaining their commitment to the principles that the cross represented. The result was a kind of practical wisdom that was both distinctively Christian and genuinely universal in its scope and effectiveness. These innovations were attracting attention from throughout the civilized world as rulers and scholars recognized that Christian communities had developed uniquely effective methods for learning from cultural diversity without losing their own identity. Delegations from China, India, Persia, and Ethiopia began arriving in Christian centers to study how this synthesis of traditional Christian wisdom and international knowledge was being achieved. The Chinese philosopher Wang Bi spent 3 years studying in Christian communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. His final report to the Chinese emperor reveals someone who was impressed not just by Christian achievements, but by their methods for maintaining cultural coherence while embracing beneficial influences from other traditions. The Christians have solved a problem that has plagued every civilization that has attempted to expand beyond its original cultural boundaries, Wang Bi wrote. They have found ways to grow stronger through contact with foreign influences rather than being weakened or corrupted by them. Their secret seems to be their conviction that truth is universal, even though it may be expressed differently in different cultures. Wang Bi was observing something that would prove crucial to the cross's eventual establishment as a truly global symbol. Christian communities had developed the confidence to engage with other cultures, precisely because they believed that their understanding of divine love was universal enough to encompass whatever truth those other cultures had discovered. This confidence was being tested As Christian influence expanded into regions where local traditions were far more different from Mediterranean culture than anything Romans had previously encountered. When Christian merchants and missionaries reached the kingdoms of Aksum in Ethiopia and Socotra in the Arabian Peninsula, they encountered societies organized according to principles that seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that both Christian and traditional Roman culture shared. In the Kingdom of Aksum, for example, women held positions of political and economic authority that would have seemed impossible in either Roman or early Christian communities. Military leadership was shared between different ethnic groups according to complex rotation systems that prevented any single community from dominating others. Economic relationships were governed by elaborate gift exchange networks that emphasized reciprocity and mutual obligation rather than individual profit or accumulation. Rather than attempting to impose familiar social arrangements on these different societies, Christian missionaries began exploring how the cross's message about human dignity and divine love might be expressed through social structures that reflected local wisdom about community organization. The results were fascinating experiments in Christian culture that looked very different from what had developed in the Mediterranean world. Queen Judith of Aksum became one of the most influential Christian rulers of the 5th century, but her approach to governance reflected distinctly Ethiopian insights about leadership and community responsibility. Instead of the centralized authority that characterized Roman imperial administration, she established distributed decision-making systems that gave different communities significant autonomy while maintaining overall coordination for addressing common challenges. Her methods were so effective that they began influencing Christian political theory throughout the empire, as scholars recognized that the cross's principles could be expressed through governmental structures that were very different from familiar Roman models. The symbol that had transformed Roman civilization was now inspiring new experiments in human governance that drew on wisdom, traditions from throughout the known world. But perhaps the most significant development was occurring in the field of education, as Christian schools began incorporating knowledge and teaching methods from cultures throughout the expanding networks of global exchange. The result was educational institutions that prepared students not just for success within Christian communities, but for effective participation in the increasingly complex and diverse world that the cross's influence was helping to create. The school that Origen established in Alexandria became the prototype for this new form of international education. Students studied classical Greek and Roman texts alongside Buddhist philosophy from India, Confucian ethics from China, and astronomical knowledge from Persian and Babylonian sources. But all of this diverse learning was integrated around Christian insights about human purpose and divine love that provided a framework for understanding how different forms of knowledge could serve human flourishing. We are preparing our students for a world that their grandparents could never have imagined, Origen wrote. A world where Christians will work alongside people from every nation and tradition to address challenges that will require all the wisdom humanity has accumulated. The cross gives us confidence to embrace this diversity because it reveals that divine love is large enough to encompass all truth and beautiful enough to inspire cooperation between peoples who might otherwise remain strangers or enemies. Origen was articulating a vision of Christian education that would influence intellectual development for centuries to come. The cross wasn't just providing moral guidance for individual believers or organizational principles for Christian communities. It was becoming the foundation for educational approaches that prepared human beings to participate effectively in an increasingly interconnected and collaborative global civilization. As the 5th century progressed, this vision was being realized in ways that exceeded the most optimistic expectations of earlier Christian leaders. Cities throughout the Mediterranean world were becoming genuinely cosmopolitan centers, where people from dozens of different cultural backgrounds collaborated on projects that served their common interests while celebrating their distinctive traditions. The new Constantinople that Theodosius II was building represented the culmination of these developments. The city's architecture reflected influences from throughout the known world, with Persian gardens, Chinese pagodas, Indian temples, and Germanic halls integrated into a unified urban design that was distinctively Christian in its overall vision, while honoring the wisdom that different cultures brought to questions of how human beings could live together harmoniously. The city's economic life was equally diverse, with trading networks that connected British tin mines to Chinese silk workshops, Ethiopian gold mines to Baltic amber forests, and Indian spice gardens to Germanic grain fields. But these commercial relationships operated according to Christian principles of fairness and mutual service that had proven more effective than traditional competitive approaches for creating sustainable prosperity. Most remarkably, the city's intellectual life brought together scholars from throughout the world who were collaborating on projects that no single cultural tradition could have undertaken independently. Christian theologians worked with Buddhist philosophers to explore questions about the relationship between human suffering and divine love. Persian astronomers collaborated with Greek mathematicians to develop more accurate understanding of celestial mechanics. Chinese physicians shared knowledge with Egyptian healers to create more effective treatments for diseases that affected populations throughout the expanding networks of global trade. These collaborations were producing discoveries that advanced human knowledge in ways that exceeded what any isolated cultural tradition had achieved. But more importantly, they were demonstrating that the cross's message about human dignity and divine love could provide a foundation for unprecedented levels of international cooperation and mutual learning. And so, dear friends, as we reach the end of this extraordinary journey, we've witnessed something that defies every expectation about how symbols evolve and transform human civilization. The cross that began as Rome's ultimate expression of shame and degradation became the foundation for the most ambitious experiment in global cooperation that the ancient world had ever attempted. From those first believers who dared to see hope in an instrument of torture, to Constantine's revolutionary embrace of Christian governance, to the emergence of truly international communities built around principles of human dignity and mutual service, we've seen how a simple wooden cross could reshape not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human development. The transformation wasn't just remarkable for its scope, but for what it reveals about the power of belief to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. When a small group of people refused to accept their world's judgment about what was possible, they opened pathways to forms of civilization that their contemporaries could never have imagined. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you this thought, that the symbols we choose to embrace have the power to transform not just our own lives, but the world around us. The cross's journey from shame to global hope reminds us that even the most despised emblems can become sources of universal transformation when approached with genuine faith in human possibility. Thank you for joining me on this incredible exploration through history's most remarkable metamorphosis. Sweet dreams, and may your own journey be filled with the kind of hope that can transform even the darkest symbols into beacons of light.